Hello and welcome. We are going to do a podcast today for our final project. What number is this final project?
The last
110.
one.
The last one, 110. So we have a collection of people here, and I just want everybody to go around in a circle. So that way you can hear everybody's voices and say your name, and we will get started on some questions concerning this project.
Hi, I'm Mark Russell.
Hi, I'm Lizzie Agee.
I am Anthony Menin.
I'm Morgan Michael.
William Marshall.
There we have it, folks. So today we are going to be specifically talking about the epistles from the New Testament. So I want us to start off with something super simple. What is an epistle?
So I guess the on-the-nose answer that me and Anthony were talking about before the podcast is, in its simplest form, an epistle is just a letter written after the death of Christ in the early church, the death and resurrection of Christ in the early church, addressing a problem or congratulating a church or a church member from another apostle.
And a lot of them do they have problems that they're trying to give solutions to that we don't fully know. If that makes sense.
It does. So that's kind of what an epistle is. So different epistles have different purposes, obviously. And as Mark was kind of saying, like some of them are kind of congratulating churches, or others are reprimanding churches too.
I mean, if we go back to the original biblical literature that we went over in 101, it's one of the 7 types of biblical literature. It falls under prescriptive literature. The epistles, and some of them fall under polemic, which is when they argue a point. So something like, I believe, James or but something like James would fall under like polemic, even though it is still considered an epistle.
All right, so moving on to our next question about epistles. So something that I found very interesting is a lot of the historical context that comes along with the epistles. As the modern day reader, we read the epistles and sometimes we're like, what in the world? How does this apply to us? When in reality, it doesn't always reply to us. Or apply to us.
It's all right. We have bloopers.
When in reality, it doesn't always necessarily apply to us because it was a letter specifically written to a church dealing with said problem, or a specific person dealing with said issues and problems. So I found that the historical context that goes along with the culture and the time period has been extremely beneficial and helpful to learning the epistles and being able to take the heart of the principle and applying the heart of it to our lives. So with that being said, I also want to draw in the Old Testament. So what are some connections or context that we need to see from the Old Testament for us to be able to understand the New Testament and the epistles?
I mean, I feel like my personal favorite of the epistles that I've studied so far, I think, would be Philemon, which is about a runaway slave who has fled to Rome and is under the employ of the Apostle Paul, who eventually convinces him to return to his master that he had run away from, with the letter of Philemon to his master Philemon, in an effort to right the wrongs and to rebuild that relationship. And I feel like that context of a slave to master relationship can be so foreign to us in a modern setting, and I feel like that's part of the reason that it's so often misinterpreted as like a scriptural endorsement of slavery. But understanding what the dynamic between slave and master would have been in that time period, and how they're called to be treated, both in the New Testament by writers and by Jesus, and also in the context of the Old Testament with laws for the treatment of slaves in, I believe, Leviticus and Deuteronomy. But understanding how he should have been treated makes the letter Philemon make a lot more sense in my mind in the context of slavery as a whole in the ancient world.
I think generally you're talking about one of two things. And sometimes they overlap, but you either have the law, and then you see that often in the ones that are written more towards the Jews. See, like Hebrews is a good example. You see a lot of the law reference. Or you'll see like where Paul will just pull reference after reference, basically making the case that Jesus is the Messiah and using the Old Testament or the Torah to support that case.
I feel like another one of those books would be James, like we just went over today. Just going through and understanding that a lot of these epistles, some of these epistles were specifically written to the Jews, or speaking of Judaizers, who, you know, like in Hebrews, where they're talking about how, you know, well, are we still having the ability to have the inheritance since we're children of Israel? But just asking those kinds of questions, since they're now in Christ, whether or not they have an inheritance and what that, like, what faith looks like now as the Jewish people. I feel like another one of the epistles that really points to the law is kind of one we went over in the beginning of the year, like Galatians. We specifically studied Galatians right after studying Deuteronomy, and I felt like with studying the law and understanding how Deuteronomy is laid out, I was better equipped to understand Galatians, especially since it talks a lot about the council at Jerusalem, Peter, and just a lot of things that were going on in the Jewish, the more prominently Jewish part of the early church.
Yeah, and talking about the early church, the epistles really do help us like get to see like how those churches were built and how leadership was put into place and how depending on what setting the church was located, some of the struggles or sufferings they may have had to face. For example, in Timothy, what is the church that they're at in Timothy?
Ephesus,
It is Ephesus, yes. Yeah, you're right, Ephesus. In Timothy, the church of Ephesus struggled with some more of the outward appearance, or they also struggled with how to ordain leaders and where leaders were to come from or how they were supposed to act. And so I find that they've been able to really just build upon the church more and more, and yeah.
I feel like especially regarding the Old Testament laws about how the worship was to be ordered is again referenced in books like Timothy, where it's talking about specifically how you're supposed to order the church, what leaders are supposed to look like. I mean, again, in Galatians it mentions that. I feel like all throughout the New Testament there's callbacks to how worship is what worship is supposed to look like in the church is a callback to how the temple would have been ordered in the Old Testament.
I also feel like a lot more of the topics are a lot more of a heart condition too now. Instead of like people would be like, oh, it's just following rules, do this, do that, but it's a lot deeper and it goes way past the surface.
Yeah, and I think also we talk about a lot of the context from the Old Testament, but then while we're reading the epistles, we can also pull from a lot of the Gospels too, and how the gospel plays out in these churches' lives, and how Paul explains what Jesus did, especially in Romans, through justification, and how we're supposed to live now with looking at the context from the Old Testament and the Gospels. So I think that's really good too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anybody else have anything they want to add to that? Okay, I'm gonna move on. So this is another good question for just kind of like to get conversation started too. But because each of us are different, what is one of your favorite epistles? Or I'm sorry, what has been one of your favorite topics from the epistles that you've learned about? And then we can expand on that topic.
I mean, I feel like I've been writing my short response on Philippians, and I think Philippians is a particularly powerful message, both in what it teaches us now and just how it's aged through the centuries and throughout our faith. A lot of the beginning of Philippians is talking about Paul's imprisonment, and he talks about, or he talks to the Philippians to encourage them, and says that they shouldn't be worried that he's in prison because it hasn't just furthered his efforts, which it has. He talks about speaking to the Praetorian Guard and how everyone within the palace knows that he's not just in prison, he's in prison for the sake of Christ. And he says it's not just that, it's that the community around him within the Roman church had been encouraged, and as that even in what seems like a loss to anyone from the outside looking in, that it has only went further in forwarding the gospel and encouraging the church, because if Paul is able to remain in prison and spread the word, the thousands of Christians around the world that were free from chains could do even more so. And I think that's really encouraging, especially in a modern setting. I think we often have a hard time applying things like that to such like severe oppression to our faith, to a modern setting, because we as Americans have a lot of religious liberty and freedom to practice, but I think even in that there is a call that Paul is giving out, then, that even though the readers of his letter in Philippians, even though they weren't imprisoned, it wasn't that there wasn't resistance, and that they should take their liberty and the freedom that they have and exercise it, because, I mean, pretty simply, not everyone can. I think that's been really cool to see throughout the beginning of that book.
Yeah. A constant theme, I feel like it kind of piggybacks off of what you were saying a little bit, Mark, is like this constant theme of like hope and suffering. Specifically in 1 Thessalonians, there was this part in verse 13 where it talks about, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brethren, but those who are asleep, so that you will not grieve as do the rest who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus." And so it continues on, giving a very shortened version of the gospel right there. But as Christians, when we handle sufferings or hard times, we need to know that we don't grieve without hope. And I find that so impactful because God really has made a way. He's provided for us in so many ways, and we need to not take that for granted, and we need to really appreciate all that he's done for us, and to praise even when you don't feel like it, and to pray even when you don't want to. And so that's been one of the constant themes that I've been seeing as of recent in the epistles.
And I feel like that definitely goes back to, I forget exactly where, and kind of embarrassing that I forgot, but it talks about how when a woman is giving birth and she's in labor, that the pain of labor is it's so great and it's so severe. But once it has passed and she has her child in her arms, that the pain and the grueling nature of labor is so far gone, because there's so much joy that comes in the morning. And again, I think it's like that idea that we might suffer, but we don't suffer without a purpose, and that there is product that comes in that suffering, like Paul's imprisonment. And I just think that the interconnected nature of everything, having studied the Word page by page and book by book, has been just so awesome and impactful to see.
Something I found interesting, I forget which book this was on. I did a short response or a discussion post or something on a book, and it was interesting because you can both read what is being said, what the message, as if you were these people and reading what he's saying to them. You can kind of read between the lines a little bit, and the fact of the matter is, Paul was persecuted. Like, Paul was one of the persecuted church, and so you can kind of read how he writes these letters and with the joy in which he writes these letters. I think that can say a lot about this too, where you have these letters, especially with like Philippians, where he's writing this with joy, even though at this point he is in prison. In all reality, that time period, he may well have had friends been killed by this. Like, he is a persecuted member of the church, and yet he's able to write this with joy. And I think that helps show what he's talking about just as much as just him telling you what he's talking about.
I feel like, just piggybacking off of that, not only is he able to give such joy in writing these letters, he's also able to provide encouragement to others. And I feel like one of my favorite letters is the letters to Timothy, because he is, this command I entrust to you, Timothy, my son, in accordance with the prophecies previously made concerning you, that by them you fight the good fight, keeping faith and a good conscience, which some have rejected and suffered shipwreck in regard to their faith. And so I feel like, just not only, he's in prison, Paul is utterly, he could be depressed, dejected, and he could shut down. But instead, he offers encouragement to all these other churches, and specifically to Timothy. He instructs Timothy on what prayer is supposed to look like, on, what offices people should hold in the church. And so I think it's really impactful to have someone who you look up to, who's going through suffering, tell you to continue to persevere. And so I think that's probably one of the reasons that I really love Timothy, and just the absolute and utter encouragement that Paul gives in regard to endurance.
And I also really think throughout the whole epistles is, you just think back to Paul and his conversion. He never met Jesus like whenever he was alive, but it was Christ in him, in that his beautiful conversion back in Acts 9, where these epistles and his joy are the fruit of Jesus alone. Mm-hmm. And it's really a beautiful thing of whenever we do allow Jesus to take hold of our life, and we are a slave to Jesus alone, and we surrender fully to him, that same joy is available to us freely. And it's just a beautiful thing. And I also think whenever we talk about like suffering and stuff like that, especially whenever we're talking about persecution for the faith, and how Paul urges people who aren't being persecuted to all the more spread the good news. I really think that, especially in the West, it's been a tool for the enemy to use this comfort to his advantage too. Mm-hmm. and just to say, oh yeah, like just downgrade the existence of evil, I think is really something that's it's something that we do. I think a lot of us do.
We were talking just recently about how like it says like know your enemy and stuff, but also that you need to know the truth so much so that way when you do see evil, it's only because you know what's true.
Like when a counterfeiter is looking for, when somebody's looking for a counterfeit, what do? They're not going to go and study every single counterfeit that's out there. They're going to go and study and know the real thing, which is one of the analogies that was given to us. I think that one of the sad parts about the American church is that we're so focused on what the epistles can give us in regard to instruction, and we forget what the gospel, we jump from the law to the epistles, and we forget the gospel in the middle. We forget the prize. Like Hebrews is talking about, why are we training? Why are we training up ourselves? We need to remember that the prize is Christ and the kingdom of God. And so I think that one of the things that has been really impactful this year is just understanding the fact that we are supposed to fight. We are supposed to keep on the good fight, and not just get so stuck in our own individualism, because that is the lie that is being spread in the church, that we are so individualistic. We forget that the Great Commission wasn't just to us as people, like individual persons, but as a church to go and make disciples of all nations together.
Amen. That was really good. Well, would any of you guys like to add anything else before we close out?
I don't think so.
All right. Thank you for listening to this podcast. And the big major point is that it all points back to Jesus. Everything does. Old, new, present. It all points back to Jesus. And with that, that is our last final project. And with that, we have been commissioned with the commission to go and spread the gospel. And so, yeah.
Well, thank you, Shannon.
Thank you,
Bye.
Shannon.
Bye.
Enjoyed the bad audio.